Hello and welcome to our Introduction to Indigenous Wellness course assignment. I'm Tim.
And I'm Mason, and we would like to take a few minutes to share about our experience engaging with Wanuskewin Heritage Park and what we learned about Indigenous health and wellness. Before we get started, we would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of the place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. Our experience taught us much about the history of the land we live, learn, and work in, and we want to acknowledge that history as we share what we have learned.
Wanuskewin is a National Historic Site located just north of Saskatoon with the goals of preserving Indigenous history, educating the public, and promoting Indigenous culture. Wanuskewin is a Cree word meaning peaceful gathering place, which is what it was historically, as the area was occupied and used as a meeting place for various Indigenous groups. The history of the land and the story it tells is also what drew us towards engaging with this place. As non-Indigenous people that now call this place home, we realize that we are now a part of that story of the land. We felt it important to receive some perspective about the rich history of this area in order to understand our place in its story and respect and honor those whose ancestors occupied it. In preparation for our visit, we got in contact with some of the staff at the park to receive permission to use our visit for the purposes of this project and familiarized ourselves with the programming that the park has to offer. We were assured that the public programming required no specific protocols, but through engaging with some outside resources, we took away some key points that we utilize in order to participate with respect, humility, and curiosity. On the day of our visit, it was beautiful and sunny at the site. Our knowledgeable guide was kind enough to take us on a tour of the exhibits inside the Interpretive Center. The exhibits showed and taught everything from historically significant elders, plant life in the area, archaeological findings, Indigenous language and culture, to settler contact, residential schools, and colonial practices. Following our tour, we explored the trail system on our own to see some of the key outdoor features like teepee rings, bison jumps, and former archaeological dig sites. The theme that stuck out to us throughout our experience was that the land has a story to tell. That story shows us a people that respected the land and used native plant life and species to sustain a rich culture and heritage of holistic health and wellness that dates back thousands of years. It also tells of the devastating changes the land and people experienced after first contact with colonizers. And now it's telling about the perseverance of Indigenous people and the efforts being made to revitalize what was lost in the efforts of colonization.
We thought that nothing represents these stories better than the saga of the bison on the prairies. One of the most meaningful exhibits described this story. Historically, the plains bison inhabited the area in large numbers and were an integral part of sustaining Indigenous culture, health, and ways of life. Many Indigenous groups that hunted these bison would use every part of the animal for everything from meat for food, hide for shelter, and bones for various tools and ceremonial practices. This practice represents the history of historical Indigenous practices that sustained health and wellness in all areas of a person, and how each aspect is connected to the natural environment and the land they are a part of. Throughout our experience at Wanuskewin, we were continually reminded of the important role bison played in the physical health of Indigenous peoples. Not only did bison provide Indigenous peoples with a reliable food source, but they also encouraged Indigenous communities to lead very active lifestyles. According to the article Bison Hunters of the Northern Plains, Indigenous peoples were constantly on the move following the bison in preparation for their hunts. Buffalo jumps like the Pimahaw jump seen at Wanuskewin were crucial to the success of traditional bison hunts that sustained their physical health. Our guide at Wanuskewin spoke to us about how settler hunting practices during the fur trade era contributed to declining rates of the bison. This declining population played a prominent role in the prevalence of food scarcity and disease throughout Indigenous populations. Bison was a resource that Indigenous people relied on heavily for both food and materials. Malnutrition played an important role in the strength of the immune system, impacting physical health.
The land and the bison are both directly tied to the spiritual life of Indigenous peoples. While Wanuskewin was home to a variety of groups with different spiritual practices, the theme between groups remains that there is a spiritual connection to the land and plants and animals that occupied it. Because the bison was such a key source of resources, it held a special place spiritually for many groups, and the skull of the bison was used in many traditional ceremonies.
After a visit to the Wanuskewin Heritage Park, we were able to recognize the cultural significance of bison throughout Indigenous communities. The connection that exists between Indigenous peoples and the bison creates an opportunity to heal the past and change the future. Throughout history, it becomes clear that emotional well-being is fostered through the spiritual connection present between Indigenous peoples and bison. According to Farmer's article on bison and reconciliation, they are considered sacred animals representing strength, resilience, and a connection to the earth. The materials and food that the bison provided to Indigenous peoples was cherished, respected, providing them a sense of emotional connection towards the animal. As the bison population began to decline, their sense of emotional well-being and connection was lost. By reintroducing bison to the Wanuskewin Heritage Park, Indigenous peoples are given the opportunity to restore emotional connections with these sacred animals and develop new connections towards Wanuskewin, as it provides Indigenous people with a safe space to develop their emotional well-being.
The bison in many ways represents the traditional ways of life shared by many Indigenous peoples throughout the history of this place. From the hunts to the ceremonies to the passing down of these practices. At Wanuskewin, we were able to imagine these ways of life that were thriving pre-contact. These ways of life were deeply connected to the land and the resources it provided, and provided Indigenous peoples some key mental health outcomes by giving them purpose, responsibility, and community. It struck us how the loss of these resources and connection to the land would have also been a loss to culture, tradition, and some key components for mental health. About 150 years ago, these bison were essentially wiped out from the prairies, representing another way Indigenous peoples were cut off from sources of health, spirituality, and wellness. However, in 2019, a bison herd was reintroduced to the area that is now growing in population. While this does not change the events of colonization or necessitate pre-contact ways of life, it does represent a movement towards restoration of land and culture.
Thank you for your time, and thank you to Wanuskewin for their generosity in sharing their space and knowledge with us.